Let's start the night off with something a little less academic and a lot more herbal. A journey not through dusty timelines or royal feuds, but through the strange, fragrant fog of medieval intoxication. Yes, they got high back then. Not with joints rolled on velvet cushions or techno beats pulsing through earpods, but with roots, resins, teas, and tinctures stirred by firelight. Tonight you'll slip through the haze with them gently and safely as we trace forgotten remedies, sacred smokes, and curious accidents that left peasants, monks, and mystics alike swaying under the moonlight. But before you sink too deep into your pillow, take a second to support this channel. A like lets this sleepy little corner of the internet find more wandering minds like yours. Subscribe if this kind of whisper history is your thing, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see this quiet community stretch across time zones like constellations blinking into view. Now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan or a soft crackling audio loop, something to hum in the background as we ease into the rhythm. Breathe. Settle. The Middle Ages weren't all plague masks and prayer books. Sometimes they were just a lonely apothecary wondering what might happen if you boiled that one funny-looking mushroom with wine. So here you are, on the edge of something ancient, something earthy, something just a little bit strange. You ready? Because this is how getting high really worked in the Middle Ages. It's easy to imagine the medieval world as gray, grim, and deeply repressed, a world where joy was scarce and sleep was hard-won, interrupted by wolves or the wailing of the wind against wooden shutters. But under all the wool mud and Latin prayers, medieval folks were still just people, curious people, tired people, people who dealt with chronic pain, sleeplessness, boredom, and heartbreak. People who sometimes turned to nature not for divine revelation, but simply to feel something different, something warmer, something gentler, something just a little bit floaty. You didn't need a velvet rope nightclub to get buzzed in medieval Europe. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a generous disregard for dosage. Because nature was the dealer back then, and she didn't label her products. Even if you were a simple farmhand with no education and fewer teeth, you still knew someone who could whip up a soothing potion. Maybe it was your grandmother with her poppy tea. Maybe it was the tanner's wife who steeped wild herbs in hot ale. Or maybe it was the village monk who had just the right vial for grief pain. Or those dreams that wouldn't stop repeating. And while there was no medieval version of Netflix and chill, there was wandering into a trance-like state under the flicker of candlelight, your body swaying slightly while the world softened at the edges. Now, of course, nobody called it getting high. That wasn't a phrase. There were no medieval stoners giggling behind haystacks. Instead, these experiences were framed as visions, healings, divine revelations, or occasionally demon possession, depending on who was watching. But behind the theology, the ritual and the robes, it was very often the same basic story. Someone found a plant, someone ingested it, and someone briefly forgot how crushingly heavy life could be in the feudal system. Take henbane, for example, one of the Middle Ages' most infamous herbs. It grew in disturbed soils, cemeteries, ruins, places where the earth had been well bothered. The plant's pale yellow flowers were streaked with dark veins, like something already halfway between this world and the next. Small doses of henbane could ease pain, settle a toothache, or soothe insomnia. It was prescribed in handwritten herbals, whispered in marketplaces, and handed from midwives to mothers, gripping the edges of wooden birthing stools. 2 leaves and a prayer, it wouldn't stop the pain, but it might make you forget where it lived. But take a little too much. That was another story. Hallucinations, convulsions, visions of dancing goats and shadowy figures in the rafters. In some towns, henbane was strictly forbidden. In others, it was sold at the back of the apothecary, like an over-the-counter lullaby with a gamble. What's strange is how casually some of these herbs entered the body, not just in teas or tonics, but baked into pies, rubbed into salves, or smuggled into religious rituals. A monk might call it a sacramental enhancer. A peasant might just call it sleep wine. A noblewoman might carry it in a scented handkerchief she pressed against her face during long sermons. The lines were blurry, and they blurred on purpose. Of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. Medicine, religion, and folk belief were tangled together, like the roots of the very plants they studied. A bishop might denounce certain herbs as diabolical one day, and take them as a remedy the next. A healer might be praised in the spring, and burned at the stake by autumn. Intent mattered. So did politics. And so did results. If your brew made someone sleep, you were a genius. If it made them speak to birds, you were a witch. But whether the brew came from a priest or a peasant woman with a basket full of wildflowers and secrets, the purpose was often the same: escape. From grief, from hunger, from the endless march of Sundays. Escape into dreams, into silence, into something a little less heavy. What's fascinating is how universal this is. Across medieval Europe, you find recurring recipes and rituals, many surprisingly consistent. Poppy seeds soaked in wine, henbane in goat's milk, dittany of Crete for visions, mandrake for sleep, belladonna for everything in between. And the people using them weren't some hidden underclass. Nobles used these herbs. Monks grew them. Physicians recorded them. Women, especially older women, knew how to dose them with a precision that rivaled apothecaries. Not because they were magical, but because they had to be. There were no pharmacies, no hospitals, no painkillers. There was just knowledge passed from hand to hand like a warm cup. You can almost imagine it: a flickering hearth, the hiss of liquid over fire, a bundle of dried leaves crumbling in a stone bowl. The scent bitter, but not unpleasant. The hands preparing it firm, practiced. Maybe the person drinking it has a broken heart. Maybe a tooth rotting in their jaw. Maybe they just want one night where the dreams are different. And maybe they'll get it. Because the truth is, when the nights were long, and the wolves howled outside the shutters, and your back ached from harvesting barley by hand, you took what comfort you could, even if it came from a bitter root soaked in hot wine, even if no one could quite agree on whether it was healing or heresy. You start to understand why they turned to plants when you realize what wasn't there. No coffee to jolt the system in the morning. No tea ritual to ground the spirit in the afternoon. No sugar rush. No chocolate to nibble for comfort. No over-the-counter anything. And certainly no blue light screens to lull your brain into a numb distraction spiral. Medieval life was sensory in the rawest sense. Sunlight in your eyes, mud on your boots, hunger gnawing at the edges of every day. So when the seasons turned harsh, or grief knocked too loud, the only thing between you and the dark was what you could grow, find, or barter. The herb garden became the medicine cabinet, and in that little patch of green hidden behind abbeys, castles, and cottages, you might discover the difference between a sleepless night and a vision from God, or from something pretending to be Him. It wasn't about thrill-seeking, not the way it is now. There were no festivals, no recreational labels, but there was desperation. There was wonder. And there was a deep, tangled knowledge of the earth, and what it could do, not just to your body, but to your mind. Monks, midwives, and root gatherers all knew the power tucked inside leaves and seeds. They called it virtue heat or essence, depending on the medical school of thought. But sometimes they just called it help. A handful of thyme steeped in wine might settle the stomach. A bit of valerian in water could calm a fretful child. Mugwort for dreaming, sage for clarity, yarrow for pain. These weren't magic spells, they were observations tested by time, and repetition passed from generation to generation. Most of the time they worked. Sometimes they didn't. And every now and then they worked far too well. That's where things got complicated. Because in a world where divine inspiration and madness were hard to tell apart, the same herb that helped you see angels might also make you run naked through the village claiming to be one. One man's cure was another man's trial by inquisition. Take, for instance, the humble poppy. Known in antiquity, revered for its milky sap and sleepy seeds, it found its way into medieval cookery and cure books alike. A bit of ground poppy seed and honey smeared on bread might ease toothache or help a baby sleep. But ramp up the dose and suddenly you're not just dreaming, you're in some other realm entirely. Perhaps that's why monks approached poppy-based medicines with a mix of awe and restraint. It helped the sick, but it also tempted the soul to wander. Then there was mugwort, sometimes called the dream herb. It grew like a weed across fields and roadsides, unassuming and easy to miss. But in herbals and old housewife manuals, mugwort was treated like a doorway. Burn it in the evening, and it was said to induce prophetic dreams. Sleep with it under your pillow, and you'd remember your visions. Some even sewed it into their clothing for protection during long journeys or childbirth. Modern science suggests mugwort does have mild psychoactive compounds, but in the Middle Ages it was considered a bridge between the known and the mystical. And people didn't just drink or eat these herbs. They bathed in them, rubbed them on their skin, hung them in bundles from rafters, rolled them into wax candles. Let their scent permeate the air during rituals or funerals or weddings. In fact, the way herbs were used often said more about the intent than the actual chemistry. A rosemary bath might mean refreshment or protection from witches. A lavender sachet might soothe a child or guard against plague demons. Intent was everything. That's what made some of these rituals so slippery in the eyes of authorities. One herbal tea was medicine. Another prepared the same way, but in the wrong context became witchcraft. A woman whispering over a pot of chamomile might be a healer in one village and burned for sorcery in another. And that inconsistency was rooted in fear, not of the plants themselves, but of the people who knew how to use them. Especially women. Especially poor women. In a time when Latin and literacy were tightly guarded by church, and university practical herbal knowledge, often passed down orally in dialect, woman to woman was both vital and threatening. These weren't abstract thinkers in robes. These were people who knew how to ease childbirth, treat ulcers, numb a gangrenous foot, and occasionally guide a soul into the kind of vision that left bishops speechless. It's no surprise then that the church kept an uneasy relationship with herbal practices. On one hand, monasteries maintained vast medicinal gardens. Monks compiled some of the earliest European herbals, detailing uses for everything from sage to deadly nightshade. On the other hand, inquisitors and bishops routinely condemned folk magic, especially if it seemed tied to women's sexuality or unregulated spiritual experience. But for the average person, it wasn't about politics. It was about getting through the night. You don't care if your poultice is approved by Galen when your head is splitting from hunger or your infant won't stop crying. You just want sleep, or silence, or a moment when the weight lifts. That's how getting high worked back then. It wasn't a party, it was a pause, a breather, a gap in the wall of daily struggle. And it could arrive in any form: a mouthful of herb-laced wine, a whispered charm over a steaming cup, a strong smell rising from a bundle tossed into the fire. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, but it gave you the hope of ease, which sometimes was all a body needed. One particularly interesting case involves something called sleep stones. These were small sachets or bundles, often containing herbs like hop flowers, rose petals, or dried henbane wrapped in linen and placed under the bed or inside a pillow. Some were carved with protective symbols or soaked in wine first. The idea was simple: place this near your head, and your dreams would turn kind. The body would rest. The mind would drift. And in the morning, maybe you wouldn't ache so much from life. Historians still argue whether these sachets were truly medicinal or mostly symbolic. But to the person using them, it hardly mattered. ritual and remedy blurred as they often do in human history. And if the sleep came easier even once, then that was enough. By now you might be wondering, how did they learn all this? How did medieval people know which herbs helped and which could kill? The answer is painfully. Trial and error, oral tradition, and sometimes by watching animals. A deer that eats a certain root and then slumps peacefully under a tree. Take note. A dog that chews a mushroom and then runs in circles until sunrise. Maybe avoid that one, or maybe not, depending on how desperate you are. In fact, a surprising number of old herbals include curious anecdotes about animals as guides to plant medicine. One old tale tells of a farmer who learned about the calming effects of valerian after seeing his cat roll ecstatically in its leaves and fall into a purring trance. Another speaks of a squirrel that was unusually sleepy after nibbling berries later identified as having mild sedative properties. Science, no. But observation? Absolutely. Even the way medieval people described these substances is fascinating. Plants weren't psychoactive or narcotic. They had heat, moisture, melancholy. They belonged to humoral theory, a system where health meant balancing your body's internal elements. Too much black bile. Take a warming herb. Too much blood used something cooling and dampening. It was more poetry than pharmacology, but again, if it worked, it worked. And when it didn't, well, that's when things got dramatic. The village healer who administered the wrong root. The noble who drank too much sleep cordial. The monk who wandered out into the woods mid-sermon speaking in tongues. Sometimes these stories became cautionary tales. Other times they became legends. But underneath them all was a quiet truth. Humans have always looked for ways to soften the sharp edges of being alive, especially at night, especially in cold seasons, especially when hope thinned like candle smoke in the rafters. So the next time you hear about medieval people as dull, superstitious brutes, remember the herbs, the bundles in rafters, the bowls of steaming roots, the quietly whispered recipes passed down through centuries. And remember that once upon a time, getting high was just another way to say, I need rest. Some nights you didn't want visions. You just wanted silence. That's where henbane came in. In the herbal lexicons of medieval Europe, few plants walked a tighter line between medicine and madness than this pale, spindly weed. Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, grew in forgotten places. Old graveyards, crumbled walls, abandoned wells. It smelled sharp and animalic, with sickly yellow blossoms and veins like a spider's path. You didn't pick it unless you had reason and gloves. It had a reputation, not because of myth or hearsay, but because of what it did predictably and repeatedly. When dried and ground henbane leaves could be brewed into a bitter tea smoked, or stirred into ale. In low doses, it dulled pain, calmed the nerves, and helped with sleeplessness. Medieval midwives used it to ease childbirth. Monastic infirmaries administered it for toothache and fever. Some surgeons, yes, they had surgeons used it before amputations to help a patient slip into sleep. That was rare, of course, because getting the dose right was harder than lacing a thread by candlelight in a windstorm. A few drops too many, and things went sideways. Delirium, confusion, convulsions, vision distortion, wild agitation followed by complete stupor. Historical sources describe users claiming to speak with angels or devils. One 12th century physician, Constantine the African, warned that misuse of henbane could make a man believe he had turned into a beast, which in a society already steeped in fears of demons and transformation wasn't a reassuring side effect. And yet it remained in use for centuries. Why? Because it worked. When carefully dosed, henbane was one of the most effective sedatives available before the invention of modern opiates. Its power was known to both folk healers and court physicians. Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess and renowned herbalist of the 12th century, wrote of henbane's cooling nature, emphasizing its usefulness for people with a hothead, a metaphorical way of describing those prone to anxiety or mania. Modern pharmacology later confirmed henbane's active compounds. Hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine are indeed potent anticholinergics, capable of altering neural transmission, reducing spasms and inducing hallucinations. But the people of the Middle Ages didn't talk about neurotransmitters. They talked about temperament. A choleric man with too much heat might be calmed by henbane. A melancholic might sink too far into lethargy if he took it. Medicine was a balancing act governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your treatment depended on your imbalance. Your imbalance depended on your nature. Your nature, well, sometimes that depended on your mood, or the stars, or the last time you had a proper meal. Still, when you were in pain, you took what you could. A pinch of dried henbane in warm beer, a smear of henbane-infused ointment over sore joints, a cloth soaked in henbane water laid across the forehead during fever. These weren't just experiments, they were caregiving in the best way people knew how. And as with all care, sometimes it healed, sometimes it harmed. One particularly striking account survives from 15th century Germany, where a woman named Elsa was accused of witchcraft after her neighbor hallucinated visions of his dead wife following an herbal treatment. Elsa had administered a brew containing henbane, along with poppy and elderflower, to help him sleep after a violent coughing fit. The sleep came. So did the visions. And when the man awoke, convinced he'd seen heaven, and possibly hell, he panicked. He reported Elsa to the village priest. She narrowly escaped punishment, thanks to the testimony of her daughter, who had prepared the brew alongside her. Was Elsa a healer? A fraud? A witch? Historians still debate whether women like her truly understood the chemical effects of what they gave, or simply passed down recipes that worked by lived experience. What's clear is that her story wasn't unique. Across Europe, records show hundreds of cases where healing crossed into danger, sometimes by intent, often by accident. What makes henbane so compelling in these stories is how often it shows up in conflicting roles. It was used in love potions, painkillers, sleeping aids, exorcisms. It was found in medicinal herbals and witch trial testimonies. It was banned in some towns and planted outside abbeys in others. The same plant could crown a saint's remedy book, or be dug up in evidence at an inquisition. A healer might pluck its leaves in reverence. A priest might burn it in fear. And then there's the sensory experience. Imagine you're the one taking it. The brew smells earthy metallic, a little bitter. You drink it slowly, cupped hands trembling. Your stomach turns once, maybe twice, and then your limbs start to feel heavy. The firelight flickers strangely. The edge of the table bends just slightly. You try to focus on your breathing, but it seems to echo now as if someone else is doing it. A shadow crosses the room. Was it real? Your eyes blur. Your body slumps. Somewhere in the dark, the pain fades. Or perhaps it deepens, then floats away. You don't quite know. Not yet. That's how henbane worked, not instantly, not predictably, but deeply. It lulled the mind, unlatched the doors between waking and dreaming. That's what made it dangerous. That's what made it beautiful. Even after the invention of more advanced medicines, henbane remained in folk practice, especially in rural regions. And in some cultures, its hallucinogenic qualities weren't feared, they were sought. In Slavic pagan rituals, henbane smoke was used to enter altered states before divination ceremonies. In Nordic lore, warriors were rumored to consume it for battle frenzy, although scholars continue to dispute the historical accuracy of this claim. What is agreed upon is that henbane was recognized as a portal, both physical and metaphysical, between the known and the mysterious. And isn't that the heart of it, the line between medicine and magic? Between vision and madness? Between what soothes and what shatters? Henbane didn't care which side you stood on. It just did what it did. And if you weren't ready, or careful, or lucky, it might show you more than you ever wanted to see. So it sat in the corners of medieval life like a rumor whispered about, reached for in desperation, blamed in scandal, praised in secret. A plant that couldn't be tamed, a medicine that wore a mask, a doorway waiting to be opened if only you had the nerve. And still the need remained, because for every story of someone who flew too close to the sun, there were hundreds who slept easier, breathed softer, healed a little faster, thanks to this strange little flower that grew where the world had once been broken. You couldn't control it. You could only hope to use it with enough humility to keep it from turning on you. And so across Europe in handwritten marginalia and whispered lullabies, henbane remained not just as a plant, but as a reminder even the smallest leaf can tip the scales between peace and peril. And of all the plants with a reputation for bending reality, few stirred more dread or fascination than the mandrake. It wasn't just an herb. It was a legend, a riddle, a living metaphor. In medieval Europe, mandrake mandragora officinarum wasn't simply dug from the earth. It was courted, feared, protected by ritual, and surrounded by more superstition than some saints. And it all began with its shape, a thick, bifurcated root that disturbingly often looked a bit like a human figure curled in pain. In a time when outward appearances were believed to reveal inward truths, the mandrake's humanoid form was enough to draw awe. People believed it had a soul, that it cried out when uprooted, that its scream could kill a man outright if he heard it. Even the act of harvesting one came with a list of bizarre instructions. Draw a circle around the plant, plug your ears with wax, tie the root to a dog, and let the animal pull it free, sacrificing the poor creature in your place. A gruesome and unnecessary step, but one that shows just how deep the folklore went. The strange thing is these beliefs weren't limited to rural peasants. You find them repeated in academic manuscripts, in monastic gardens, in the writings of educated physicians. The fear was universal, and yet, so was the desire to possess it. Because the mandrake wasn't just a symbol. It worked at least in ways people could feel. In small doses, it acted as a soporific and mild anesthetic. In larger amounts, it induced hallucinations, paralysis, and near-death trances. Mainstream historical sources confirm that mandrake was widely used in early surgical preparations, especially before the development of distilled alcohol as a true anesthetic. It was sometimes blended into soporific sponges, a medieval method for knocking patients unconscious, before procedures like tooth extraction, cauterization, or even amputation. Physicians soaked cloth in mandrake infusion, often combined with hemlock opium or henbane, then held it over the patient's mouth and nose. There was no standard dosage. Success meant unconsciousness. Failure meant suffocation or worse, waking up halfway through the cut. The use of mandrake extended beyond surgery. It featured in fertility charms, protection amulets, and even legal contracts. In Jewish mystical texts like the Zohar, mandrake is associated with love and conception. In the book of Genesis, Leah gives mandrakes to her sister Rachel to aid her chances of pregnancy. Later medieval traditions carried that association forward. Couples might wear small mandrake roots in pouches as love tokens. Others kept them hidden in the home, believing they would bring prosperity or protect against curses. But here's where things turned murky. You didn't just have a mandrake root. You cared for it. Some people clothed them, cradled them, even fed them with drops of wine or milk. Treat it well, they believed, and it would grant visions, luck, insight. Mistreat it, and it might turn on you. If that sounds like animism, that's because it is. The belief that the mandrake had agency of personality wasn't just superstition. It was a framework for dealing with power. You don't fear an herb that sits quietly on a shelf. But if it screams, if it feels, then you respect it. You treat it like a guest, or a god. And so the rituals were born, not out of ignorance, but out of reverence mixed with terror. The harvest rites, the sleeping charms, the midnight prayers whispered over a root shaped like a child. Historians still argue whether the mandrake's reputation grew from its actual psychoactive effects, or from the sheer creepiness of its appearance. But no one disputes that it lingered half medicine, half myth in the collective mind of Europe for centuries. In folk medicine, mandrake was sometimes ground into powder and added to wine or mead. This wasn't just to get someone drunk. It was to loosen the senses, to invite dreams, to make childbirth a little less terrifying, or grief a little less sharp. One 13th century charm book advised soaking the root in red wine under a new moon, then drinking the liquid before sleep to see the one you most long for. Whether it worked or not was almost beside the point. The act, the preparation, the intention was the ritual, and the ritual itself was medicine. Yet for all its spiritual aura, mandrake's chemistry was very real. The root contains powerful tropane alkaloids, including scopolamine and atropine, the same class of compounds found in henbane and belladonna. These substances act on the central nervous system, causing everything from drowsiness and dry mouth to vivid hallucinations, and in higher doses, respiratory paralysis. So yes, it could bring dreams. It could also bring death. That duality fascinated medieval minds. To them, the mandrake wasn't just dangerous, it was sacred, because it was dangerous. It reminded them that all true power carries risk, and that lesson fit neatly within the moral framework of the time temptation hubris punishment. Handle the root with humility and you might be blessed. Handle it recklessly and you'd pay the price. What's particularly interesting is how mandrake roots were often carved or shaped by the hands that pulled them. If a root didn't look human enough, an apothecary might snip and bind it to create the illusion arms, legs, even a head. Some were dyed or anointed with oil to preserve their lifelike appearance. These weren't just medicinal items, they were props, talismans, symbols. Part practical drug, part performance art. A medieval blend of pharmacy and theater. And yet, despite the cautionary tales, people kept using it. Because the promise was too alluring, a night of restful sleep, a glimpse beyond the veil, an edge taken off the unbearable. Even the risk of death wasn't enough to dissuade those whose lives already brushed against mortality every day. For a medieval peasant working sunup to sundown, often in pain, always under pressure, the idea of a little help, even from a root that might scream, wasn't foolish. It was logical. And it wasn't only peasants. Kings and queens sought mandrake. Physicians prized it. Wealthy collectors displayed dried specimens in glass cases, along with rare herbs, bezoars, and mummified crocodiles. The mandrake was more than medicine, it was prestige. Proof that you had access to the strange and sacred. In art it appeared in marginalia, and illuminated manuscripts, sometimes with little human legs, or panicked animals fleeing its harvest. In stories it crept into romance horror comedy. In the world of symbols it remained lodged between heaven and earth, rooted in the dark, reaching toward light, always halfway between life and something else. You might still wonder, was all this fear justified? After all, modern science can now isolate the chemical compounds, measure the doses, predict the effects. Isn't it all just pharmacology with a cape on? Well, yes and no. Because what the mandrake represented wasn't just chemical. It was emotional, psychological, mythological. A mirror for medieval anxieties about death knowledge control. To touch the mandrake was to flirt with those ideas, to say, I'm hurting, and I'll risk something strange if it helps. I'll believe a root can dream if it means I might sleep. And so they kept pulling it from the soil, carefully, sometimes with a dog, always with a prayer. And even now, centuries later, if you walk the ruins of an old monastery garden, or a lonely hillside where the soil hasn't been disturbed in years, and you see a plant with dusky leaves and a forked root hiding beneath the earth, be gentle, be curious, and maybe listen, because some say it still whispers. It is one thing to sip a tea that soothes you gently to sleep. It is another to place your trust in a flower that can open the gates of heaven or hell with a single petal. That was the allure and the terror of belladonna. Known also as deadly nightshade, this glossy-leaved, violet-blossomed plant was both miracle and menace, sought after for its power, and feared for the same reason. It didn't grow in shadows, it cast them. And it cast them across gardens, monasteries, and the minds of medieval healers who knew exactly what it could do. Belladonna, from the Italian for beautiful lady, earned its romantic name not because of its healing properties, but because of its role in a dangerous cosmetic ritual. In Renaissance Italy, women used drops of its extract to dilate their pupils, giving them the wide-eyed, glassy look that was considered irresistibly alluring. What they didn't realize or didn't care to admit was that each drop also blurred their vision and risked damaging their optic nerves. But this practice came much later in history. Long before it was a beauty trick, belladonna was steeped in both medicine and mythology. In the Middle Ages, belladonna was a central ingredient in many herbal mixtures, particularly in sedative sleep aids and trance-inducing concoctions. Its use wasn't casual. It wasn't something you'd sprinkle into soup or leave in the pantry next to the rosemary. It was kept in locked chests, wrapped in warnings known to those who'd studied its temperamental chemistry, with an intimacy bordering on fear. When dried, powdered, and diluted properly, belladonna could numb pain, reduce muscle spasms, and relax the body in profound ways. Physicians used it to treat gout ulcers and even tremors. In some documented surgical settings, primitive though they were, it served alongside mandrake and opium in crude anesthetic blends. One of the best preserved examples of its use in European medicine appears in the writings of the 11th century medical scholar Avicenna ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine detailed various plant-based treatments, including those using nightshade derivatives. Though Avicenna wrote in the Islamic Golden Age, his texts circulated throughout medieval Europe, translated into Latin, forming the backbone of medical instruction from Italy to England. But the people who used belladonna most frequently, though least officially, were the folk healers. Women often older and unmarried, living on the edge of the village or in its center, yet always a bit outside the circle. They weren't witches in the theatrical sense. They were caretakers. They knew the difference between a tea that calmed a cough and a tincture that took away pain so thoroughly the soul might follow. A few drops in a cup might lead to restful dreams. A few too many, and the dreamer might see visions of saints' angels, and according to several trial records, horned beasts who spoke in Latin. Whether those visions came from chemical interactions or the sleeper's own expectations is impossible to know now. But to the medieval mind, they were real, powerful, dangerous. In fact, one of the enduring associations of belladonna with the supernatural stems from its ability to induce vivid, sometimes terrifying hallucinations. Users often reported the sensation of flying, of leaving their body, or of speaking to entities not visible to others. These experiences were especially notable among women accused of witchcraft. In court transcripts and inquisitorial documents, accusers and accused alike described salves and ointments made from belladonna and other tropane alkaloid-rich plants like henbane and mandrake. These ointments, when rubbed into the skin, particularly in areas with high absorption, such as the armpits or groin, could cause altered states without ever being ingested. And here lies the root of the flying witch myth. Women didn't actually straddle broomsticks and soar into the sky, but the ointment applied to the handle of a broom, then pressed against sensitive skin, would absorb quickly and induce a floating sensation. To the women experiencing this, it felt like flying. To the church, it looked like heresy. To later generations, it became folklore. This is a mainstream historical interpretation, supported by researchers like David W. Chans, and documented in the writings of 15th century inquisitor Jordanus de Bergamo, who recounted how women confessed often under torture to visions of flight induced by ointments, prepared by the devil himself. Of course, the actual recipes were far more botanical than demonic, but the line between perception and prosecution was razor thin. Yet for every horror story, there were quieter ones. the mother who brewed a light infusion to ease her child's fever, the old farmer's wife who used belladonna to numb her aching joints through the winter, the midwife who applied a salve during childbirth not to invoke spirits, but to reduce pain when the screams became unbearable. These stories didn't make it into the church records, because they ended in relief, not spectacle. But they happened. They were real. And they speak to a medieval world far more complex than the caricature of plague and piety. The fascination with belladonna wasn't confined to the illiterate or the rural. Alchemists, scholars, and physicians explored its properties with scientific curiosity. Its inclusion in magical grimoires and medical codices alike reveals how deeply it straddled the boundaries between healing and harm heaven and hallucination. One example comes from the Physica, a 12th century herbal text, written by Hildegard of Bingen. While she didn't mention belladonna by name in all its forms, her descriptions of plants that cool the fire of the body and induce sleep so deep that the soul may journey closely resemble modern profiles of belladonna-like effects. Later, herbalists would be more explicit cataloging it, alongside wolfsbane and foxglove, in the dangerous but useful category. The science of the time couldn't explain belladonna's mechanism of action, of course, but modern pharmacology can. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, two alkaloids that block acetylcholine in the nervous system, resulting in muscle relaxation sedation, and at higher doses hallucinations and memory disruption. These compounds are so potent that even today derivatives of belladonna are used in medicine, albeit with careful dosing and regulation. They appear in anti-nausea patches, pre-anesthesia drugs, and eye dilation drops. But the medieval user didn't know any of that. All they knew was that a small bundle of dried leaves and berries kept in a drawer or a pouch, or a tiny carved box, could mean the difference between suffering and sleep. That sometimes the dreams brought comfort, that sometimes they brought more. One preserved account from 14th century England describes a noblewoman who, after the loss of her son, refused all food and company. Her physician, fearing she would starve herself to death, brewed a tea of belladonna, chamomile, and poppy, and gave it to her under the guise of a sleeping draught. She slept for 2 days. When she woke, she claimed to have spoken with her son in a garden made of starlight. She ate. She lived. No one asked what she really saw. These stories sit in the middle of science and myth. They're not easily categorized, and that's why they mattered so much. Belladonna wasn't just a drug. It was a doorway, frightening, fragrant, and lined with uncertainty. You didn't take it unless you had reason. But if you had reason, you might risk everything. Even the appearance of the plant seemed to warn you. Shiny black berries that looked like ink marbles, enticing to children, deadly in handfuls. Leaves that glistened with dew in the morning, but shriveled quickly in heat. A stem that seemed to lean just slightly, as if always listening. It wasn't a plant that begged to be trusted. It was a plant that demanded respect. That's why so many medieval herbals wrote about belladonna in half-whispers, as if mentioning it too loudly might wake something. The line between blessing and curse was always thin, and in a world already haunted by uncertainty, crop failure, infant mortality, the endless grip of feudal duty people didn't take chances lightly. But they still took them, because when you couldn't sleep and the memories crowded in too tight, and your chest ached not from illness, but from something you had no words for, then a single dried leaf in hot wine, a whispered prayer, a slow drift into darkness. Maybe that was worth the risk. And for some, what came after the visions, the visitations, the soft-footed saints with sad eyes, wasn't frightening at all. It was a kind of grace, an unspoken pact between body and plant, a peace offering from the natural world, sharp-edged but honest. That's what belladonna offered. Not safety, not certainty, but quiet. Somewhere between the flicker of a hearth fire and the crackling hush of wind against thatched roofs, stories began to circulate quietly, but persistently, about women who flew through the night. They didn't have wings. They didn't wear feathers or climb towers. Instead, they had broom's ointments and a secret knowledge of herbs that no bishop could quite explain and no court could entirely suppress. They were the women who knew where the wild things grew. The ones who didn't just survive in the margins of medieval society, they thrived there. They were midwives, healers, herbalists, and yes, sometimes they were called witches. But the flying part, that wasn't entirely metaphor. The image of a crone streaking across the moon on a broomstick might feel like pure Halloween cartoonery, but its roots run deep into historical pharmacology, and they're coated in something potent. What medieval inquisitors and later folklore remembered as witches' flight was likely a hallucinated experience, induced by plant-based salves known today as flying ointments. These mixtures were not designed for ingestion. Instead, they were rubbed into the skin, often on areas with thin membranes and high absorption, such as the armpits, temples, genitals, or inner thighs. The recipe varied by region and healer, but the core ingredients stayed eerily consistent: belladonna, henbane, mandrake, sometimes wolfsbane, or datura. Each of these contains powerful tropane alkaloids chemicals that affect the nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic functions, like heart rate, vision balance, and more importantly, cognition. In low to moderate doses, the result was a feeling of warmth, disorientation, lightness, a floating sensation, with a bit more visions, with a bit too much unconsciousness, seizures, or death. But those who got it right, they didn't just feel relief, they felt flight. This isn't a modern reinterpretation or speculation. Historical texts from as early as the 1400s, including the Malleus Maleficarum record confessions, from accused witches who described smearing salves on broomsticks and placing them between their legs. When examined in light of contemporary science, it becomes evident that these testimonies, though extracted under duress, often matched the pharmacological effects of the ingredients involved. The strange euphoria, the weightlessness, the dreamlike passage through time. It's not that they actually flew, it's that, under the influence of their ointments, they believed they did. And that belief mattered. In a world where the spiritual and physical coexisted without clear separation, where saints walked among peasants in dreams and demons, whispered from the corners of drafty churches, a vision was as real as a road. If a woman said she flew to a distant forest and danced with spirits beneath an ancient oak, she wasn't necessarily lying. She may have experienced every step of it, with the full sensory weight of lived memory. That was the terrifying part, not the broomstick, but the blurred boundary between body and imagination. Mainstream historical records reveal that these ointments weren't secret in the way we might assume. Recipes or warnings appeared in books written by clergy, healers, and scholars alike. The 16th century physician Andres Laguna, who translated the ancient herbal guide De Materia Medica, claimed to have witnessed a woman apply one such ointment and fall into a deep sleep for 36 hours. When she awoke, she was convinced she had been dancing at a feast miles away. Laguna, being a man of science, dismissed her story, but the experience shook him enough to document it. And it wasn't just women. Men, too, used these balms, particularly those involved in folk traditions or pagan holdovers that still lingered in isolated communities. But women bore the brunt of suspicion, in part because their roles as midwives and herbalists gave them access to knowledge the church wanted centralized and regulated. Their ability to ease pain, induce sleep, or guide a difficult birth made them both invaluable and dangerous. Many of the so-called witches didn't see themselves that way at all. They were caretakers. They understood the body not through Latin texts, but through lived experience: what herbs soothed the wound, what root dulled grief, what bark helped a restless child sleep through the night. And yes, some of them experimented. They combined herbs with fats, oils, resins. They ground, steeped, stirred, and tested, not for power, but for relief. And in a time when childbirth could kill fevers went unnamed, and the official line from the church was to pray harder, those ointments weren't evil. They were a lifeline. The salves themselves often used animal fat as a base, sometimes goose, sometimes pig. Beeswax might be added for stability. Then came the herbs dried or fresh, sometimes steeped in wine first, sometimes pulverized with ash or clay. Once mixed and gently heated, the balm was stored in small pots ready for ritual or rescue. When used ritually, the ointment's effects were often framed in spiritual terms. Users claimed to communicate with spirits, glimpse the future, or commune with deities from old pantheons. But when used domestically, the same mixture was a painkiller, a sedative, a comfort. Historians still argue whether these ointments were primarily medicinal or mystical in intent. Likely both. In a world where the line between science and spirit was porous, most users didn't make the distinction. If a balm soothed the pain of childbirth and also gave you a vision of your dead grandmother smiling from a field of poppies, was that a side effect or a blessing? What's important is that the knowledge behind these concoctions wasn't accidental. It was inherited, matrilineal, taught in whispers and practice in observation. Not from books, but from moments watching which roots a deer avoided, which berries made the birds sing longer, which plants left your neighbor silent for hours after a simple infusion. And in this knowledge there was power, not political power, not the kind you wield with armies or laws, but the power to change how someone feels, to bring warmth to pain, to make the unbearable bearable even just for a night. And that kind of power made the church deeply uncomfortable, because it bypassed doctrine. It didn't ask permission. It worked in kitchens and huts, not cathedrals. And it was often wielded by those the hierarchy couldn't control. So the broomstick became a symbol not of flight, but of fear. Fear that a woman might leave her body even metaphorically. Fear that she might not need a priest to heal her family. Fear that she might speak to a god that wasn't theirs. And still the salves were made. In modern pharmacology, the effects of flying ointment ingredients are well documented. Scopolamine induces confusion and amnesia. Atropine causes dilation, muscle relaxation, and dreamlike hallucinations. When absorbed through the skin, especially in high concentrations, they bypass the digestive system, acting directly on the central nervous system. This makes the experience stronger and sometimes more disorienting, but also more immersive. It's easy to see why someone might truly believe they had flown, that they had left the world behind, that their soul, or something like it, had wandered into a realm where pain couldn't follow. Maybe it was a meadow, maybe a circle of stones, maybe a quiet sky full of singing stars. For a few hours they were elsewhere, and maybe for someone trapped by poverty grief, or the relentless repetition of medieval life that was enough. The church, of course, saw only rebellion. The salves became evidence in trials. The confessions many wrung out under torture were used to justify executions. And yet the recipes kept appearing, hidden in margins, whispered between generations, carried in memory. Because you can outlaw a plant, you can burn a book, you can silence a voice, but you can't unmake a balm once it's been stirred. You can't erase the fact that for a moment, a weary woman placed something warm and fragrant on her skin, closed her eyes and flew. You wouldn't think incense could change the way someone feels. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just something sweet you burned to cover the scent of livestock and sweat. It was part of the air itself, woven into daily ritual, sacred ceremony, and sensory memory. It filled temples and chapels and quiet rooms where people hoped for something more than what they could see. It wasn't merely for fragrance, it was transformation, suspended in smoke. Step inside a medieval church during the High Mass, and the first thing you'd notice before the light through stained glass Before the echo of chant was the scent. Thick, ancient, almost physical. A curling sweetness with notes of resin and pine and mystery. That was frankincense, or sometimes myrrh, or a regional substitute if trade was tight. It filled the air, drifting from a swinging censer in the hands of a priest. And it wasn't just for show. Medieval theologians believed the smoke helped carry prayers upward, literally lifting words into the heavens. But even more than that, it prepared the mind to receive the divine. Today we'd call it atmosphere. Back then it was presence. You didn't need to be a mystic to feel its effect. The moment the incense lit, the space changed. Shadows moved differently. People's voices quieted. Even your breathing slowed, as if your body remembered something older than language. And in that moment, in that stillness, the idea of touching something holy didn't seem so far-fetched. But this wasn't just Christian. In mosques across the Islamic world, especially in Andalusia, and the Levant incense was a staple of spiritual life. Burned not just during prayer, but during study meditation, and even social gatherings, it marked the boundary between the ordinary and the sacred. Resins like oud and ambergris wafted through the air, altering mood and focus, not with force but with softness. Sufi mystics, known for their deep devotional practices, often used incense as part of a larger sensory immersion. Rhythmic chanting, swaying motion, focused breath. Hashish, too, played a role for some Sufi orders, though never universally or without controversy. Certain dervishes believed it helped dissolve the ego, allowing them to experience divine unity more fully. Mainstream historical accounts, such as those preserved in Persian poetry and mystic treatises, document hashish as a meditative tool sometimes likened to spiritual wine. Not everyone agreed, of course. Many Islamic scholars condemned its use. But in specific circles, the high was a vehicle, not a detour. Back in Europe, the same dynamic played out in different clothes. Christian mystics like Hildegard of Bingen spoke of divine visions during prolonged prayer and fasting, often in incense-filled spaces. The question lingers: how much of what they saw was spiritual, and how much was sensory? Historians still debate this. Did the incense simply set the stage for spiritual experience? Or did it induce one after all? Some resins like labdanum and styrax contain mild psychoactive properties when burned in high concentrations. And churches didn't burn incense lightly. They filled chapels with it, hour after hour, service after service. For congregants kneeling with empty stomachs in low light surrounded by chant, the effect may have been more than symbolic. Then there were the Eastern traditions, where scent was not just accompaniment, it was communication. In Buddhist temples across China, Tibet, and Japan, incense acted as an offering and a bridge. Each stick represented a prayer. Each breath taken in was a meditation. The burning of sandalwood or aloes wood wasn't just for peace. It was to purify the space and the self. Monks learned to time their prayers by the rate of incense consumption. In some monasteries, elaborate incense clocks were built designed to burn at consistent rates, marking hours not with bells but with fragrance. And in those temples, too, states of altered awareness were not uncommon. Not wild or disorienting, but deep, focused, quiet. A shift in perception not unlike the one you might feel slipping into a dream just before sleep takes hold. But incense didn't always come with ritual. Sometimes it was just there in homes, in workshops, in public baths. In medieval Jewish communities, incense marked holy days and was believed to ward off illness, especially during plague outbreaks. The idea was partly spiritual and partly medical, a belief that sweet smells could purify corrupted air, that burning herbs could shield the body from death. And in an era where people watched their neighbors collapse in the street, that belief wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. In fact, the connection between incense and disease prevention had a long-standing history. During the Black Death, physicians walked the streets with herb-filled pomanders, or long beak-like masks packed with spices and resins. Not because they thought it smelled nicer, though it did, but because they believed bad air or miasma carried disease. And so they burned incense. They chewed cloves. They boiled lavender, anything to cleanse the invisible. And whether or not it worked in a biomedical sense, it offered something else control. A way to push back against the unseen, the unstoppable. A ritual gesture in a chaotic world. Even outside of faith or fear, incense became part of life's quiet punctuation marks. In merchant homes along the Mediterranean morning routines often included a small charcoal burner on which spices were tossed while the household stirred awake. In some cases it was believed to sharpen memory, in others simply to greet the day with warmth. In Northern European homes, especially those wealthier or tied to monastic institutions, dried herbs like thyme, sage, and mint were burned in small bowls before evening prayers. Children were taught to recognize certain smells as good or clean, long before soap became common. And in the dark heart of winter, when damp and cold made every surface ache, the smell of warm smoke curling upward was by itself a kind of therapy. Even among those who couldn't afford exotic resins, local substitutes were found: juniper pine needles, mugwort rosemary. They were crushed and sprinkled on hearths, or bundled and tossed into flames. The scent wasn't always pleasant by modern standards. It was sharp, sometimes medicinal, but it was consistent, familiar, anchoring. That's what incense did. It anchored you, marked a moment, said this part of the day is different. Whether for prayer protection or simply pause, it signaled the mind to soften its grip, to rest, to drift. It's easy to look back and dismiss these rituals as symbolic, or even primitive, but the sensory logic behind them holds up. Even today, research shows that smell is our most direct link to memory and emotion, that a scent can unlock calm faster than words. That ritual, even if quiet and simple, can soothe the nervous system. So it's no surprise that medieval people used fragrance to blur the line between the physical and the spiritual, between being awake and being aware. And maybe, just maybe, those long hours spent in smoky cathedrals, chanting in dim light, breathing deeply of ancient resins, really did lift some part of the soul. Maybe not into heaven, but at least into stillness. That's all most of them were ever looking for. You didn't always choose to get high in the Middle Ages. Sometimes it chose you. Sometimes it was a mistake, an accident. A piece of bread that looked normal but felt wrong. A spoonful of honey that sent the room spinning. A perfectly ordinary morning that turned into a slow-motion dream or a waking nightmare. Because while monks and healers experimented with herbs and ointments, the average medieval person could stumble into altered consciousness without ever stepping near an apothecary. Let's start with ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and other cereal grains, especially in damp conditions. It appears as dark, shriveled growths on grain heads, almost like burnt kernels. If you weren't looking closely, you might grind it into flour with the rest of the crop, bake it into bread, feed it to your family, and then wait. What followed wasn't a pleasant high. It was something between poisoning and possession. Tingling limbs, convulsions, violent hallucinations, burning sensations in the hands and feet, gangrene, madness. People clawed at their skin, swore they saw demons, screamed that their legs were on fire. In some cases, their limbs blackened and rotted until they fell off. The condition became known as St. Anthony's fire, and it swept through communities with terrifying randomness. Mainstream historical records confirm that ergotism caused major outbreaks across medieval Europe, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire during the 10th to 17th centuries. In 857 CE, a particularly severe outbreak in the Rhine Valley killed thousands. Monasteries dedicated to St. Anthony were established to treat victims, offering clean bread, fresh air, and spiritual comfort. But the fungus remained poorly understood. It was blamed on sin demons or divine punishment. No one suspected the rye. Historians still argue whether certain medieval mass hysterias, like the dancing plagues of Strasbourg and Aachen, were triggered by ergot-contaminated bread. In these strange episodes, entire towns reportedly danced for days without rest, some to the point of collapse or death. Did they choose to move that way? Or were they trapped inside a shared hallucination? It's hard to say. What's certain is that ergot didn't just affect individuals. It could haunt entire harvests. And because rye was a staple grain for the poor, outbreaks were more likely to hit villages than castles. The rich had options: fine wheat, imported grain, professionally milled flour. The poor had what they could grow. And if the summer was wet and the storage damp well, breakfast might come with a curse. Unlike ergot, the second major accidental intoxicant of the Middle Ages was sweet, deceptively so. We call it mad honey. In the mountainous regions of Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey, a specific species of rhododendron grows wild. Its flowers produce nectar, laced with grey-anotoxins, compounds that are highly toxic to humans in even small doses. Local bees, unaware or unbothered by the chemistry, collect this nectar and transform it into honey. The result: a golden aromatic substance that can, depending on how much you eat, either relax you gently or knock you out cold. Consumed in very small doses, mad honey could induce lightheadedness, warmth, even euphoria. Taken in larger amounts, it led to nausea, slowed heart rate, blurred vision, and vivid hallucinations. And because it looked and tasted like regular honey, people often had no idea what they were ingesting until it was too late. This wasn't a secret in the ancient world. As early as the 4th century BCE, the Greek historian Xenophon described soldiers consuming wild honey in the hills of Pontus and falling into a dazed stupor. Later, in 67 BCE, King Mithridates VI allegedly used mad honey as a weapon, leaving honeycombs along the path of advancing Roman troops. The soldiers, gorged on the honey, became disoriented and were swiftly defeated. In the Middle Ages, mad honey was less a military tactic and more an unfortunate surprise. Villagers unfamiliar with the properties of local flora might trade for a jar from a traveling merchant or harvest wild combs themselves, only to find their feast turned into a strange waking dream. There are scattered reports of small communities falling ill after sharing a honey-rich dessert. Not many people died, but they didn't forget it either. What's fascinating is how quickly these experiences entered folklore. Stories of enchanted food, cursed feasts, and magic honey abound in medieval oral traditions. And while the magical framing often distanced the story from its botanical roots, the core detail, a substance that made you see things, remained consistent. Unlike carefully measured herbal brews, accidental highs weren't about intention. They were about luck, or the lack of it. And the effects could be spiritual or terrifying. Imagine eating a slice of rye bread and suddenly feeling your fingers go numb. The edges of the room blur. You hear music though no one is playing. Your feet begin to twitch. Your body sways. People around you scream or laugh. You don't know why, and neither do they. Maybe it's a miracle. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe it's both. In a world without germ theory or food safety regulations, these episodes weren't categorized as medical events. They were interpreted spiritually, morally, cosmically. A sign from God, a test, a punishment, or for some a gateway. Because not all accidental highs were feared. Some were remembered fondly. A dreamy feeling after honeyed wine. A warm, floating sensation after a strange berry. Grandparents whispered these tales like secrets, half warnings, half invitations. Don't eat the dark bread on rainy weeks. That honey's from the wrong side of the valley. If the rabbit won't eat it, you shouldn't either. But sometimes, you still did. There's a theory still debated among scholars that many medieval visions, especially those experienced by mystics and saints, may have been influenced by low-level environmental intoxication. Mold spores, fermented berries, tinctures taken without knowledge of their full effect. Hildegard of Bingen's extraordinary visions have been attributed to migraines, epilepsy, or psychotropic exposure, though no consensus exists. What remains clear is that altered states of consciousness were not rare. Whether sought intentionally or stumbled upon, they happened frequently. That's what makes this part of the story so compelling. It wasn't about ritual or knowledge or careful preparation. It was about unpredictability, a reminder that nature doesn't always wait for permission, that sometimes your next state of mind depends on what bloomed on the hillside that spring. And yet people kept eating, kept baking, kept sipping. Not out of recklessness, but because life was hard and food was precious. You didn't toss a loaf because it looked funny. You didn't refuse honey because it shimmered strangely in the jar. You took the risk. And sometimes that risk led to dreams. But sometimes it led to the fire. In parts of France and Germany, records exist of entire villages falling into disarray after suspected mass poisoning. Whether it was ergot or contaminated wine or something else entirely, the effects were undeniable hallucinations, dancing fits, delusions. People walked into rivers, climbed trees and refused to come down, swore they saw the Virgin Mary weeping blood or angels made of flame. The local clergy blamed witches. Trials followed. So did executions. And so once again the line between medicine and magic blurred. The same substances that brought comfort and escape also brought fear and repression. The same bread that fed your child might betray you. The same honey that sweetened your tea might steal your mind. Even now, centuries later, the idea is unsettling. That something so small, so familiar could change your world, could open a door and refuse to let you close it. But maybe that's the point. In the Middle Ages, the world wasn't divided cleanly between sacred and profane, real and unreal, sober and altered. Everything flowed into everything else. And whether you entered that flow by choice, by accident, or by hunger once you were in it, you had to ride it out. So you slept it off, or prayed, or tried to make sense of the things you saw. And the next day, if you were lucky, you woke up, a little shaken, a little wiser, and maybe a little more curious about what else the earth was hiding. And now we drift farther east away from the foggy monasteries and moss-wrapped cottages of medieval Europe into lands where the art of altered perception took a very different shape. In ancient China, the pursuit of transcendence didn't hide in shadows or get whispered behind closed doors. It stood at the center of Taoist philosophy, openly explored through herbs, minerals, meditation, and breath. Here, getting high wasn't about escaping suffering. It was about understanding it, transforming it, sometimes even leaving the body entirely behind. You find yourself in a pine-covered mountain range, the mist curling around the rocks like silk. In a small, secluded hut carved into the hillside, a Taoist adept sits cross-legged, his breath slow, his pulse quiet. In front of him a small brazier, a clay bowl, and a set of carefully weighed powders. These were not recreational ingredients. They were serious tools for a serious goal: immortality. The Taoist tradition, which dates back over 2 millennia and peaked during the Tang and Song dynasties, emphasized balance with the cosmos and harmony with the Tao, the mysterious, ineffable force that underlies all existence. Achieving alignment with this force required discipline, fasting, stillness, inner alchemy, and sometimes outer alchemy. Enter the dream herbs. Of the many plants used in traditional Taoist practice, one of the most revered was lingzhi, also known as reishi mushroom. This lacquered reddish fungus grew on decaying trees and was considered an elixir of immortality, not because it granted eternal life in a literal sense, but because it nourished what Taoists called jingqi and shen, the 3 vital energies of the body. Lingzhi wasn't hallucinogenic in the way we define the term now, but its reputation for enhancing meditation, extending life, and sharpening spiritual sensitivity placed it in the upper echelons of ancient Chinese materia medica. Mainstream historical texts such as the Shenong Benkao Jing, China's earliest pharmacopoeia, compiled during the Han Dynasty, circa 200 CE, classified lingji as a superior herb safe, beneficial and spiritually potent. Unlike other substances that targeted only the physical body, lingji was believed to calm the mind and open pathways of subtle awareness. It was less about visions and more about perception, seeing reality more clearly with fewer obstructions. But not all herbs in Taoist tradition were gentle. Some Taoist alchemists experimented with more potent plants like datura and aconite, powerful and potentially lethal when misused. A few sects of Taoist inner alchemy believed that entering trance states, even at the cost of physical discomfort, could grant access to other realms of existence. Reports survive of practitioners drinking infusions of wild herbs and then entering catatonic meditation for days. Their goals weren't escape or amusement, but transformation to dissolve ego-shift consciousness and return to the primordial void of the Tao. This practice intersected with shamanic traditions in China's southwestern regions, where minority groups like the Bai and Yi used local psychoactive plants in initiation rituals. Some scholars argue that early Taoist mystical techniques borrowed from or evolved alongside these folk practices, blending philosophy with pharmacology. One of the most mysterious substances referenced in Taoist literature is the so-called cinnabar elixir, a combination of mercury sulfide and various minerals believed to unlock cosmic insight. Unfortunately, it also unlocked mercury poisoning. While many seekers of immortality fell ill or died from these alchemical brews, the philosophical interpretation survived the true elixir was internal. Historians still debate how widespread the use of psychoactive herbs truly was in Taoist monastic circles. Some believe it was limited to elite adepts. Others suggest it was more common, simply not widely documented, due to secrecy and oral transmission. But regardless of scope, the intent is unmistakable in Taoist. Thought-altered states were tools not to forget the world, but to penetrate it more deeply. Imagine sitting in a stone cell at the base of a sacred mountain. You have fasted for 3 days. You've been practicing breath cycles, taught by your master holding, releasing, stilling. Outside, a herbalist kneels beside a brazier, heating a tea made from polygala asparagus root and schisandra, all known in Chinese medicine for calming the spirit and opening the heart. You drink, you lie back, and your breath becomes wider than your body. Not euphoria, not fear, just stillness. What follows isn't a vision of dragons or gods. It's a soft, dreamlike clarity, a feeling that the boundary between you and the pine trees, the wind, the stars, is thinner than you thought. That's what these ancient seekers were after. Not hallucinations, not illusions, but oneness, a dissolving of the walls between form and emptiness. And they weren't alone. In Taoist texts like the Zhenjing and Baopuzi, written by the famous alchemist Ge Hong during the Jin dynasty, 4th century CE, there are numerous descriptions of herbs used to lighten the body, allow one to travel unseen, or summon immortals. Ge Hong meticulously categorized substances based on their effects, some producing levitation interpreted now as dissociation, others causing glowing skin, inner warmth, or visionary dreams. Many of these descriptions, while poetic, align with known side effects of psychoactive compounds. It's worth noting that unlike in medieval Europe, these explorations weren't necessarily taboo. They were regulated, yes, but not inherently sinful. There was no equivalent to the Inquisition chasing down Taoist herbalists. Instead, danger came from within the practice. A failed alchemical formula, an imbalanced constitution, a misstep on the path to cosmic unity. In a particularly striking passage from the Baopuzi, Ge Hong warns, "If the mind is not quiet, even the gentlest medicine becomes poison," a sentiment as true in the 4th century as it is now. And so these practices survive, some in secret, others openly through dynasties and revolutions. Some herbs like Hisho Wu and Goteng still appear in modern Chinese pharmacies, sold for their calming or clarifying properties. The language has changed, but the goal remains the same: balance, clarity, a way to soften the boundary between the world and what lies just beneath it. We often think of getting high as a leap away from the self, but in Taoist tradition it was a return, a turning inward so complete that the outer world faded to mist. The wind in the trees, the scent of cedar, the rhythm of the breath all became one movement, one sound, one thoughtless awareness. And perhaps that's the quiet genius of it. There were no broomsticks, no screams, no firelight chants, just the slow boiling of water, the scent of herbs on the air, and a silence so deep it echoed through the lungs. You drank, you waited, you dissolved. And somewhere in the blur between sleep and stillness, you met something vast, ancient, and unnameable. They called it Tao. Now that you've wandered through Taoist mists and mushroom-laced mountains, let's take a different path down stone steps into ancient Greek temples and Roman courtyards where getting high meant mystery divinity and something sacred in the shared experience of intoxication. Here you didn't slip into altered states alone. You did it with your neighbors, your priest, maybe even your local politician. This was a place where divine revelation came in a chalice, and ecstasy was organized seasonal and stamped with a government seal. In the ancient world, particularly among the Greeks, the boundaries between religion, medicine, and intoxication were almost non-existent. If something made you feel strange, you didn't question whether it was medicinal or recreational. You asked which god sent it. And the gods had quite the selection. We begin with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, revelry, madness, and, paradoxically, divine truth. In his cult, sacred drunkenness wasn't a joke. It was the way you peeled back the veil. Through wine, often mixed with herbs, honey, and sometimes hallucinogenic ingredients, worshippers entered trance states, danced ecstatically, and performed rituals designed to dissolve the self and commune with the divine. This was called enthusiasmos, literally to be filled with the god. Mainstream historical records confirm that wine in the ancient world was rarely consumed the way we drink it now. It wasn't sipped straight, it was a cocktail. Ancient recipes show it mixed with things like myrrh, cannabis resin, poppy extracts, and even seawater. Plato himself mentions that such wine was to be consumed at festivals, but only under strict regulation, perhaps to ensure the divine stayed divine and didn't become a drunken brawl. Nowhere was this more profoundly experienced than in the Eleusinian Mystery's secret initiation rites held annually outside Athens in honor of Demeter and Persephone. For centuries, thousands of Greeks and even Romans made the pilgrimage to Eleusis. They fasted, they bathed, they drank something called the kykeon, a mysterious barley-based potion believed to contain ergot or other psychoactive substances. Historians still argue whether the kykeon was actually hallucinogenic. Some insist it was symbolic, a blend of fermented grain and mint. Others point to the powerful descriptions of visions and epiphanies that participants reported. What's clear is that the Eleusinian mysteries were transformative. Initiates came out of the ritual saying they no longer feared death. You imagine yourself in a dark temple hall, candles flickering, robed figures swaying gently, and in your hand a cup of earthy, bitter liquid. You drink. The air seems thicker, the singing more vivid. Then, perhaps just maybe an image forms before your eyes. A mother weeping for her lost daughter, a flower blooming in darkness, a voice whispering that death is only the beginning of another cycle. That was the promise of Eleusis. Not intoxication, but transcendence. In Rome, things took a slightly more bureaucratic turn. As Roman society absorbed Greek religion, the mysteries continued, but so did public concern. Cults that induced altered states were both fascinating and feared. The Bacchanalia festivals dedicated to Bacchus, the Roman Dionysus, grew wild enough that the Roman Senate outlawed them in a 186 BCE, citing moral decay and sedition. And yet people kept whispering, meeting, drinking, dancing in the night. It seems not even senators could legislate the human craving for awe. The line between sacred and profane remained hazy. For instance, opium derived from the poppy was widely used in Greco-Roman medicine. Physicians like Galen prescribed it for pain, insomnia, and even emotional turmoil. But the same poppy extract also appeared in love potions and oracles' cups. A single seed could either cure or confuse depending on the context. Here's the quirky tidbit in some Greek mystery cults. Members chewed laurel leaves, the same leaves used to crown poets and victors. Why? Because laurel contains compounds that in large doses can induce lightheadedness and auditory hallucinations. Some scholars believe this might be how the Oracle of Delphi entered her trance-like states, though others argue it was the noxious gases from a nearby fault line. Either way, the result was the same otherworldly visions, cryptic truths, and a sense that something vast and timeless was speaking through her. Unlike medieval Europe, where anything too ecstatic could be deemed witchcraft, the ancient Mediterranean world celebrated these states as long as they were socially sanctioned and properly managed. A festival, a temple, a priest to pour the wine. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. There's a lesson in that. Not every culture feared altered states. Some revered them, built entire traditions around them, gave them names, spaces, and guardians. And in doing so, they gave people something more than a high. They gave them meaning. Picture yourself again, not as an outsider peeking in, but as a participant. You stand barefoot on temple steps. The sun has just dipped behind the marble columns. In your hands, a small vessel. In your chest, the hum of anticipation. The smell of thyme and olive oil floats on the wind. You lift the cup drink deeply and the world begins to shimmer, not as illusion but as revelation. You've had a long day. But the ancients, they had long nights. Long shimmering nights filled with music, fire, sacred wine, and the kind of stillness that only comes when the world is spinning just a little slower than usual. And maybe that's exactly what they were after. You might think incense is just for setting a spa mood, or covering up the smell of last night's garlic bread. But in ancient Egypt, it meant much more. It was sacred scientific, and depending on who you asked, possibly a little psychedelic. Tonight you drift downstream on the Nile, past papyrus thickets and limestone temples, where priests burned exotic resins, poppy tinctures flowed in golden cups, and the boundary between the living and the divine grew fragrant and soft. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with balance marked the sacred order. To disturb that balance was to risk chaos. So maintaining spiritual and physical harmony wasn't optional. It was national policy. And part of that cosmic housekeeping involved substances that soothed, enchanted, or elevated the mind. Let's start with incense kai-fi to be exact. This wasn't your off-the-shelf sandalwood. Kai-fi was a meticulously prepared blend of over a dozen ingredients, including frankincense myrrh, cinnamon juniper berries, honey raisins, and even wine-soaked herbs. Recipes varied slightly depending on the era and the temple, but they all followed the same principal harmony of scent and spirit. Mainstream historical sources, especially translations of papyri from the temples of Edfu and Edfu, describe kai-fi as more than just aromatic. It was medicine. According to the Egyptian priest and historian Manetho, writing in the Ptolemaic period, kai-fi was consumed as a drink to treat ailments of the lungs, liver, and skin. But more fascinatingly, it was believed to induce vivid dreams and bring clarity of mind. When burned at dusk, kai-fi guided both the sleeping body and the waking soul into communication with the divine. So you picture yourself there inside a stone sanctuary as a priest, slowly grinds ingredients on a flat basalt slab. The air is cool, heavy with ritual. The incense begins to smoke, curling upward in silent ribbons, and you feel your thoughts loosen like reeds in the river current. But that's just the beginning. The Egyptians didn't stop with incense. They cultivated and processed the opium poppy Papaver somniferum as early as the New Kingdom, possibly introduced via trade with Crete or Mesopotamia. Archaeological finds include ceremonial vessels, shaped like poppy capsules found in tombs and sanctuaries, hinting that poppy extracts were not only used medicinally but ritually. Now, before your modern ears perk up too high, no, they weren't exactly puffing opium pipes on Pharaoh's palace balconies. But poppy-based infusions were used to dull pain, soothe coughing, and yes, bring about a gentle, forgetful sleep. Egyptian physicians listed it in medical texts like the Abbas Papyrus, dated around 1550 BCE. One remedy reads like a recipe for dreamless rest: crushed poppy fermented grains and honey administered as a night potion. Mainstream historical fact confirms that Egyptian medicine was astonishingly advanced for its time. They had surgical techniques, prosthetics, and even dental tools. But more than that, they viewed the body and spirit as a single system. To heal one, you had to treat the other. And sometimes that meant blurring the edges of awareness, just enough for the soul to do its work. Enter blue lotus Nymphea caerulea, the elegant aquatic flower often depicted in tomb art temple reliefs and perfume jars. It wasn't just beautiful, it was mildly psychoactive. When steeped in wine, the blue lotus produced euphoria relaxation, and in some cases mild hallucinations. Modern analysis shows that it contains alkaloids that interact with dopamine receptors in the brain. In other words, yes, it could get you just a little high. Imagine yourself at a banquet in Thebes. Musicians strum lutes and clap rhythmically. Dancers swirl. Guests wear cones of scented fat that slowly melt into their wigs. You lift a cup of lotus wine to your lips. The flavor is strange, herbal floral, a touch bitter. Time begins to flow differently. Your limbs feel lighter. The laughter at the next table seems to echo and shimmer. Someone is reciting a hymn to Hathor, goddess of music, joy, and intoxication. The quirky tidbit: some pharaohs and high priests would inhale incense fumes during religious ceremonies so potent that they would enter trance states described by scribes as beholding the gods or speaking with the ancestors. This wasn't metaphor. This was considered a legitimate mode of divine communication. And unlike in medieval Europe, where such behavior might land you on trial for sorcery in Egypt, it was sacred duty. The temples were laboratories. The priests were researchers. Every resin burned, every flower steeped, every powder crushed was part of a millennia-long experiment in spiritual elevation. Yet there's scholarly debate over just how intentionally psychoactive these rituals were. Were the Egyptians deliberately inducing altered states, or were the effects incidental and simply interpreted through a spiritual lens? Did the priests know their frankincense and poppy resin were tweaking the brain? Or did they simply notice that people felt closer to Ra after a strong dose of night incense? Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians used substances for the high or for the holiness. But maybe it doesn't have to be either or. Maybe it was both, wrapped in linen, gilded in gold, and carried through incense-thick hallways by barefoot acolytes under a sky full of stars. The Egyptians believed life was preparation for the afterlife. So every step you took in waking hours echoed in the eternity to come. Altered states weren't an escape, they were rehearsal. Each high was a preview of the great sleep, the great dream where you would meet Osiris, balance your heart against a feather, and step into the field of reeds forever. And so tonight you drift in the same direction. The Nile has always flowed toward stillness, toward quiet, toward something just beyond sight. Let the incense curl. Let the poppy steep. Let the blue lotus bloom. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Somewhere deep in the equatorial forests of Central and West Africa, a healer kneels in the red earth, whispering over a root. It's not magic. It's memory. And that root, called iboga, is about to become the bridge between two worlds, the living and the ancestral. Tonight you leave the temples of Egypt behind and follow the drumbeats of African spirit journeys, where plants weren't just remedies, they were guides. For countless indigenous African cultures, especially among the Fang-Bwiti and Mitsogo peoples, in what is now Gabon and Cameroon entering, altered states of consciousness was not taboo. It was tradition. It was community. It was how you healed, how you grew up, how you talked to your dead grandmother. And it all started with the plants. Take Tabernanthe iboga. The small yellow root that chewed, brewed, or powdered can send the mind spiraling into dreamlike visions that last hours, even days. This isn't casual recreation. This is a rite of passage. Among the Bwiti, for instance, a young initiate's first experience with iboga marks the beginning of their spiritual adulthood. Eyes closed, body still, they lie in darkness, as the root unlocks visions of ancestors of spirit animals, of past mistakes and future duties. For them, iboga is not an escape. It is an education. The mainstream historical fact: European explorers in the 19th century, including French colonial doctors and missionaries, documented the use of iboga in Central Africa. Though initially dismissed as primitive or superstitious, later ethnobotanists recognized the complexity of these practices. In fact, the alkaloid ibogaine extracted from the root has been the subject of modern medical trials for its potential to treat addiction and trauma. It's now classified as a psychoactive substance with powerful neurological effects, including vivid dream states, heightened memory recall, and temporary ego dissolution. But that's just one region, one root. Across the African continent, countless other plants were used to dance between worlds. The Yoruba of Nigeria employed kola nut in ritual divination and trance ceremonies, combining it with drumming and call and response chants to induce focused states. In Ethiopia, coffee, yes, the one in your kitchen, originated as a sacred plant. The Oromo people, long before Starbucks, consumed it in ceremonies that involved rhythmic movement and spiritual storytelling. In Zimbabwe, the San and Shona peoples performed mbira ceremonies with thumb piano clapping and chanting designed to open portals to the spirit world. While the music alone could induce a trance, some ceremonies also included the burning of herbs like sage bushman's candle or Silene capensis, the latter known as the African dream root. Silene's white blossoms held secrets. Consumed as a tea, the root could stir vivid lucid dreams and was used by Xhosa shamans to seek visions during sleep. Now pause here. You're sitting by a low fire under a sky so dark it swallows thought. Someone hands you a carved wooden cup. You sip. It's bitter earthy, tinged with ash. The drums are soft like a heartbeat, and somewhere inside you, beneath the bones and the worries, a door begins to creak open. The quirky tidbit: some African ceremonies weren't just personal, they were theatrical. Entire villages would gather for all-night trance rituals, where the possessed would dance with eyes rolled back, speaking in ancestral voices. During the Bwiti disco night ceremonies, colored lights, mirrors, and rapid-fire polyrhythms were used to overwhelm the senses. It wasn't chaos, it was calibration. The goal wasn't to get high. The goal was to realign the community with its past. But even within these rich traditions, there's scholarly debate. Were these substances primarily pharmacological tools? Or were they spiritual accelerators? Were the trance states the product of chemistry or choreography? Was it the iboga that opened the mind or the storytelling that came with it? Anthropologists continue to debate the interplay of belief biology and social design in African trance medicine. And yet amid all these questions, one truth remains. For many African cultures, altered states were not fringe behaviors. They were the heartbeat of culture. They healed the sick. They mourned the dead. They named the unborn. And they did it with roots, with leaves, with rhythm. You continue walking slower now. There's dust on your feet and warmth in your chest. The world has turned quiet again. Somewhere nearby, a mbira plinks gently like raindrops on metal. The ancestors are not gone. They are watching, maybe even whispering. The plants knew how to reach them. And now perhaps so do you. You leave the firelight behind, but its warmth lingers. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of a thumb piano fades into stillness. Now we move forward in time to oil lamps and canvas-stretched studios to ink-stained fingers and smoke-fogged libraries. You're entering the Renaissance, a world of awakening genius and powdered medicine cabinets, and nestled among the scrolls, pigments and anatomical sketches, opium pipes, poppy extracts, and a slow dance between pain and inspiration. Let's begin with a familiar face, Paracelsus, the 16th century physician and alchemist, who once claimed, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so." It was he who coined the phrase laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol he praised, for its ability to ease suffering dull grief, and occasionally make a man believe he could talk to angels. Laudanum became a staple in European apothecaries by the late Renaissance, and once it entered the bloodstream of Europe, it rarely left. The mainstream historical fact. By the 17th century, opium-based medicines had become widely available in Europe. Apothecaries sold bottles of laudanum over the counter for ailments ranging from headaches to heartbreaks. Poets, painters, and physicians alike swore by it. The painter Caravaggio, for instance, lived a notoriously volatile life, frequently injured, ill, and exiled, during which many historians suspect he relied on opiates for pain relief. Whether it was inspiration or intoxication, the line was blurry. The same goes for John Milton, who, blinded in his later years, may have used opiates while writing Paradise Lost. Now imagine this. You're seated in a candlelit room, the table cluttered with quills, pigments, and glass bottles. Outside, plague bells ring. Inside, you cradle a cup laced with opium, the taste bitter as regret. It doesn't knock you unconscious, it stretches the edges of thought, lets sorrow float. For the overworked, overstimulated, and terminally curious, substances like laudanum became both balm and muse. And this wasn't limited to painters or poets. Midwives used poppy teas to dull the pain of childbirth. Surgeons used opium as an early anesthetic. Aristocrats nibbled on candied poppy seeds during lavish banquets, especially in regions like Venice, where Eastern trade routes brought in exotic goods and sometimes a little more than spice. But here's the quirky tidbit. Renaissance cabinets of curiosity, those eclectic wooden boxes filled with feathers, bones, and coral, sometimes also included dragon tears or Persian sleep dust, romantic euphemisms for exotic opiates. Some collectors believed these substances preserved the dreams of faraway lands. And who knows? After a few drops, you might have believed it too. Of course, not everyone welcomed these mind-altering aids. The scholarly debate surrounding Renaissance drug use remains unresolved. Were artists and thinkers using these substances to break through creative blocks, or to escape the weight of Renaissance anxieties? Were their masterpieces born of inspiration or sedation? Some argue that opium served as a quiet bridge between pain and productivity. Others warn that we risk romanticizing addiction by imagining every melancholic genius sipping laudanum under moonlight. Still, it's hard to deny how embedded these substances became. You'll find them in the shadows of Shakespeare's verses, the stillness of Vermeer's interiors, and the echoing reverence of Bach's organ music. Even if these figures never used such things directly, they lived in a world where opiates were everywhere, in cures, in myths, in whispered advice passed between tired apprentices. And if we shift the lens to ordinary folks, the story doesn't grow less colorful. Apothecaries sold poppy syrups to soothe children's teething pain. Peasants mixed valerian mandrake and opium to ease the ache of field work. Sailors wounded in war or ravaged by scurvy often depended on crude opiate mixtures to stay upright. In Venice, where East met West, Turkish merchants brought in opium pressed into bricks. It wasn't yet smoked widely in Europe, but tinctures and teas abounded. And in some elite salons, guests experimented with poppy-laced cordials during philosophical debates, because nothing says metaphysics like a warm narcotic haze and a talk about the soul. You walk through this world now, the cobblestones uneven beneath your boots. The air smells of ink and candle wax. Above a wooden sign swings outside a physician's door bearing the image of a poppy bloom. Inside, glass jars line the shelves. Some are labeled with Latin. Others simply read, "For sleep, for sorrows," or "For that which cannot be named." You pause at one jar. It contains nothing but brown powder and a single pressed violet. A note reads, "Take with music." You're not in the forest anymore. There are no drums or dream roots. But here in this candlelit quiet, the longing is the same. A longing to soften pain, to hold sadness gently, to drift a little without falling away. The candles flicker out as you step onto smooth wooden floors. Tatami mats hush your movements. A kettle whispers on the brazier. Welcome to a different kind of altered state. One with no smoke, no visions, no screaming roots. Just steam silence and the careful clink of porcelain. In this section, you cross into medieval Japan, where the search for stillness didn't involve flight or frenzy. It involved tea incense and the breath between thoughts. Here, altered states weren't pursued through wild hallucinations. They were invited slowly and with purpose. The Japanese approach, shaped by Zen Buddhism and Shinto tradition, wasn't about escape. It was about refinement. You didn't leave your body. You tuned it like an instrument. The goal was not to break the self, but to peel it back layer by quiet layer. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. During the Muromachi period, 1336–1573, Japanese monks returning from China introduced chanoyu, the way of tea, as a meditative ritual. Tea, especially matcha powdered green tea, wasn't just a beverage. It was a bridge to presence. The preparation from warming the bowl to whisking the jade-colored foam was carried out in near silence. Every gesture was deliberate. Every breath counted. Samurai practiced it to sharpen awareness. Monks used it to quiet the ego. This wasn't intoxication in the Western sense. But matcha contains L-theanine, a compound that enhances alpha brainwaves, inducing a state of calm alertness. Combined with the low doses of caffeine, this created a natural meditative flow, a subtle, sustained mental clarity praised by Zen poets, warriors, and artists alike. And then there was Kodo, the art of incense appreciation. In a small chamber, participants would sit cross-legged around a burner, passing around tiny fragrant wood chips like sacred treasures. Unlike Western incense burned to fill a room, these chips were heated just enough to release trace aromas. You didn't just smell incense, you listened to it. The term used was manko, to hear the scent, and hearing meant surrendering fully to the moment. The incense itself, often aloes wood or kayara, the most prized form, so valuable it was sometimes worth more than gold. Samurai collected incense recipes like secret weapons, and poets carried scent memories in their sleeves, writing verses about plum blossom smoke and temple wind. Some believed certain woods could balance the humours, others that they invited spirits. But mostly, incense was a tuning fork for the soul. Here's the quirky tidbit. In formal incense ceremonies, guests competed in games called genjiko, where they tried to identify different wood types by scent alone, sometimes without even looking at the burner. The answers were recorded using special incense diagrams inspired by the tale of Genji, a Heian-era novel rich with romantic intrigue and perfumed longing. It was sensory scholarship, quiet and playful. But was any of this truly mind-altering? That's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these rituals, though not pharmacological, created psychological changes similar to drug-induced trance-time dilation, sensory enhancement, even ego detachment. Others insist the effect was metaphorical ritual, calm, not true alteration. Yet Zen monks described moments of such deep absorption during kodo or tea practice that the world seemed to dissolve. Is that not a kind of high? And while the samurai class embraced Zen calm to steady their sword hands, the common folk had their own versions. Farmers drank roasted barley tea before shrine visits. Fishermen carried charm pouches of mugwort to ward off bad dreams. And in spring, some women would sleep with cherry blossom petals under their pillows, believing they could induce pleasant visions. You kneel now in a tea hut, the door barely shoulder wide. Humility begins at the threshold. The host offers a bowl. The matcha is warm, grassy, astringent. It coats your tongue and draws you inward, not with force, but invitation. Across from you, an incense burner releases a breath of agarwood. The smoke curls weightless, and you follow it not up but in. It's different from iboga or henbane or poppy wine, but the aim is the same: to soften, to still, to become small enough to hear the silence behind the world. You don't need wings or visions, just a bowl of breath and a few leaves ground to dust. And so here you are, cross-legged on the soft earth of history, surrounded by centuries of smoke leaves, roots, and rituals. You've wandered from the henbane-laced dreams of medieval midwives to the precision silence of a Japanese tea hut. You've ducked under broomsticks, tripped over cursed rye, inhaled temples into your lungs, and felt the hush of matcha on your tongue. And what have you discovered, really? That across every age, every empire's fall, and every culture's flame, people have always sought a way to drift. It didn't matter if they called it divine communion, pain relief trance, or just taking the edge off. The impulse was the same. When the body hurt, or the heart was heavy, or the mind simply buzzed too loudly with worry, someone somewhere reached for a plant, a scent, a sip, or a song, and said, "Maybe this will help." Let's begin then with the truth under it all. Mainstream historical fact confirms that nearly every documented civilization has had some culturally sanctioned method of altering consciousness. From the Sumerian beer tablets of Mesopotamia to the Aztec mushroom stones, the Ayurvedic texts of India, the Egyptian poppy papyri, the Sibylline oracles of Rome, and the Taoist immortality brews of China. Humans across time and space have not only known about mind-altering substances, they've integrated them into their core traditions. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were refined, recorded, and repeated. But what stands out is how each culture framed the experience. For medieval Europeans, intoxication was a mystery, sometimes sacred, sometimes demonic. In Africa, it was a lineage. In China, a pathway to balance. In the Islamic world, a paradox forbidden and poetic. In Japan, a whisper instead of a roar. Some used trance to talk to spirits. Others to forget their troubles. Others to simply listen for the voice within. And here lies a scholarly debate that still echoes in anthropology. Was the use of mind-altering substances universal because of shared human neurochemistry, or because every society needed a narrative way to explain suffering, insight, and transformation? Some argue that psychoactive plants shaped religion. Others believe religion shaped the interpretation of psychoactive plants. In other words, did the mushroom create the god, or did the god create the mushroom myth? It's tempting to draw a neat circle around all of this and call it ancient drugs. But that would miss the point. Because this story isn't really about plants or powders or potions. It's about people. Tired people. Grieving people. Curious people. People like you sitting now in the hush of night, trying to understand the soft blur where your mind ends and something else begins. So let's revisit them, not just what they used, but why. A monk in a frost-covered abbey drinks a warm wine spiced with mandrake root. He says it's to speak to angels. Maybe it's just to forget the chill of stone and the absence of love. A Sufi mystic smokes hashish in the quiet of the desert night. He recites verses, each one a breath wrapped in metaphor. He says he's dissolving the self. Maybe he's just chasing a memory. A Yoruba healer grinds iboga into powder and feeds it to an orphan boy surrounded by elders. They say it will connect him to his ancestors. Maybe it also helps him sleep through the ache of loss. A Roman priest prepares kykeon for the Eleusinian mysteries, stirring barley mint and possibly ergot-tainted water. The initiates tremble as visions bloom. They say they've seen Persephone return. Maybe they've seen themselves. A Japanese tea master bows low and turns the ceramic bowl. The matcha steams in the morning light. He says nothing. Maybe that's the point. Even the modern world is not so different. We still take pills for pain. We light candles when we cry. We sip wine when words fail us. The tools change. The longing does not. Which brings us to the quirky tidbit, something strangely modern. In 1970, a NASA researcher published findings that some astronauts, after long periods in space, described mild hallucinations, floating colors, soft voices, a sense of connectedness beyond explanation. No drugs, no fumes, just isolation, silence, and the spinning earth far below. What does that tell us? That maybe under the right conditions, the human brain doesn't need external help to dissolve boundaries. It just needs time and stillness. And isn't that what tonight has been? A long drift through the fog of history, each section a little softer, a little slower, like the mind easing out of its tight grip on the day. In the end, you don't need to chew a sacred root or chant under moonlight to join this human tradition. Sometimes lying still with a blanket, a voice, and an open heart is enough. Because seeking peace, seeking meaning, seeking a different angle on reality, that's the most ancient ritual of all. You're part of that now. You've walked barefoot through the Middle Ages, sipped incense with Egyptian priests, tiptoed into African dreamscapes, and now you rest full of centuries. Not buzzing, not high, just softer. The world will still be here in the morning. But for now, for this quiet moment, you've slipped just a little outside of it. And that's okay. Let the monks have their potions, the witches their flying ointments, the mystics their smoke. You have something better. You have stillness. You have this story. You have sleep. And now, as the final echoes of history drift into silence, you find yourself floating, weightless, thoughtless in the stillness that has been waiting all along. Let the world outside dissolve like mist. You've wandered through centuries of fog and firelight, listened to monks whisper, and felt the soft hush of incense curling in sacred halls. You've stood beside ancient fires, watched healers grind strange roots, and heard the laughter of villagers daring to forget their suffering for one strange, sweet night. And in all of that, you've learned something that no book alone can teach, that peace was never something to be chased. It was always something to be allowed. Let your breath slow. Let the warmth around you feel a little heavier, like a thick woolen cloak drawn gently over your shoulders. Your eyes may be closed now or closing. That's good. That's what they're meant to do. You're not in a medieval tavern, not in a Zen temple, not on the edge of a desert watching stars. You're here, safe, still, dream ready. Whatever worries followed you to this moment, you've outpaced them. They don't belong in the quiet. Not now. Not tonight. There's nothing left to learn. No more names or dates to remember. Only this softness. Only this gentle ending. You're exactly where you need to be. And with that, we let the story go. Let your mind drift. Let your body rest. Let the night carry you the rest of the way.